The title of this panel is called Queering Radical Spaces. Thank you, Shannen, for asking me and being okay with me moderating this. My name is Mariel Fiedler. I am active at the center, and in my life I've just been active in a lot of queer spaces and very interested in the intersectionality between political spaces and how identity comes into play in those spaces. So if everybody on the panel can introduce themselves, if they feel that they're affiliated with any specific groups, please feel free to talk about that. And then just say your pronouns that you feel comfortable using, and if you feel that it applies to the conversation, if you have an identity that applies in this conversation. Yeah.
My name is Skyler Clarke. My pronouns are he, him, his. I identify as queer and as a trans man. I am loosely affiliated. I spend a lot of time working with the Center Long Beach. Yeah.
My name's Shannen Maas. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm a co-founder of Empty Cages Los Angeles. I co-organized this conference, and I'm a youth mentor with Mentoring Youth Through Empowerment.
Hey, I'm Rex. My pronouns are he, him, his. I'm kind of all over the places in terms of organizations. I am a part of Squad, which is a queer and trans person of color collective for visibility of us folks. And then I'm a part of this collective called OCNC, or Oceania, Coalition of Northern California, where I now reside in. But basically all about visibility for Pacific Islanders, and that's an important part of my identity.
Oh, I guess I should also add that I'm a white passing woman of color. I feel like that'll probably come up at some point.
Okay, great. So welcome everybody, and I guess I really liked this part about a panel I went to recently, kind of like audience participation. If there's a question or that you might have, or if you have an answer to a question or something to say, then I think that's really cool to be a part of it. Just be respectful, I guess. So I guess when Shannen and I were kind of debriefing about this and talking, there were two things that came to mind, and I guess there's like the buzzword about, is marriage just a gay agenda, and this is a conversation that's being had all the time. So I guess, is there a queer agenda, you know what I mean? And if there is, or within your groups that you identify within, what do you think that could be? I guess we could talk broadly and then kind of try to narrow down these key points that might be part of queering identity. And I guess a big buzzword is safety and people feeling safe in their spaces. So, if
we have to always start with it.
No, I guess we don't have to, but I feel like I'm sorry, you guys. My brain is totally fried. I've just been going nonstop for a long time now, so I'm probably not going to be as articulate as I might like to be. But this is poor planning on my part. I put this in the last slot of the day, on the last day of the conference. So, I guess
I can ask a pointed question. How do you feel that your queer identity has played out in animal rights groups?
That's kind of complicated. I think when I first came into the animal rights movement, I was in a relationship with a cis man, and we've since broken up, and it's sort of interesting to see how people who I know through the animal rights movement will be taken aback when I talk about a woman I'm dating or a non-binary person that I'm seeing, and they'll actually say things like, "Oh, well, I'll always see you as straight because of your past relationship," and I'm really it's erasure, and it makes me extremely uncomfortable. And then it also makes me wonder, why is it that I, as a person, and I feel like maybe this is a conversation for a feminist panel as well as a queer panel, but why is my relationship with one man, like what defines me as a person, to these people in the animal rights movement. So that's rough.
For me, I know that you were talking about like a queer agenda, and I know for me, I think it's always just been about like cultivating, I guess, like indigeneity within queerness, because like a lot of cultures before colonization, all these European people coming over, we had past, we had past genders and sexualities. So I think it's important to cultivate and even excavate like those past parts of ourselves, and I think that I think it's really important to also do like outreach for communities of color, because often those communities are more queerphobic, transphobic, and it's honestly just like the diaspora responds to like oppression in heteronormativity and misogyny even, and it's important to like keep our queerness, and I think the gay agenda is all about whiteness, and it's about appealing to capitalism and straight people, or like, and I'm not really into that.
Can you define diaspora for those in the audience who may not be familiar with
the diaspora is like a loose term for someone who is native to one place of the world, and then like a whole bunch of people leave that place for certain reasons, maybe like economic reasons, maybe they were forcefully taken, etc.
So I feel like sort of queerness and the queer agenda is such a broad topic. I'm going to kind of just run with like a personal thing that I've been on recently. And so kind of talking about not suffering erasure and the preservation of queer identity. So it goes back to also sort of how relationships are perceived. So if I don't consistently come out as trans all the time, sometimes people don't know, my partner being a cis woman, people do not understand why we don't want to be perceived as straight. And so trying to kind of really get across that queerness is, it is a deeply held identity, and it's not just sort of a definition of like the genders in a relationship, that it's so much more broad than that, and that it's really a way of looking at the world and the culture and things of that nature.
Do you find that a lot of the queer agenda is seeking like a libertarianism, like let me do what I want, and like you just accept it, you accept difference as difference, or is there some sort of like all umbrella-ing like drive towards people accepting people of all different gender identities, all different sexualities, no matter what that might be? Or like does your form of acceptance take note of education? Do you find that there's like a queer education that can be developed and disseminated? Or, I'm not being very specific.
I feel like I don't understand the question.
Yes, I guess because,
I think I know what you're saying.
You can answer, and then maybe I'll.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm gonna use like a contrast. Like I feel like LGBT like politics and identity is all about like learning from like, I guess, these images, and like about like who you're supposed to be and what you're supposed to aspire towards. Where queerness, I mean, I know you as like one of my like queer parents, like out of the many, like I think it's just like stories of struggle and stories of just making it through, and I think it's always about resistance with queerness. With like LGBT politics, like Stonewall happened, okay, let's go buy a like house now and we can get married. Like, it's over, it's done. Where like queerness, it's all about, it's like, it's continuous, and there's a whole bunch of factors that are always happening, and it's not always about necessarily one part of your identity, but it's like facilitating all parts of your identity, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I actually really agree with you about that. I think that queerness encompasses not just an understanding of your gender expression or like sexual or gender expression identity or sexual orientation. It also focuses on the other facets of your identity, like if you're a person of color, if you have a disability, class issues, lots of other things that people can identify with, or communities that people are a part of. And I feel like the gay agenda is really mostly concerned, and I feel like once I say this, everyone's just going to be so nauseous because they've probably heard it so many times before, but I feel like the LGBT agenda is to protect the interests of assimilated, like rich white LGBT people. And that's obviously not a representation, an accurate representation of what our community really needs. And when I say our community, I am in this instance including LGBT people in that because they feel as though I'm included in their community and they like to speak for me. So right now I'm going to speak for them and decide what they need.
Yeah, I think so. Kind of addressing. I know I heard a little bit in there where you were like, do you think that there's like a sort of a queer education that can be like disseminated and had? And I think that for me, and because I did sort of start with my identity in a place of like identifying under like LGBT umbrella, right, but not actively identifying as queer. Thank you, Shannen, also for that, for the introduction to that.
You're just everyone's queer mom, apparently.
Exactly. And I think for me, like there was like a base level of education, obviously, and understanding of you know, sort of issues that are present in the queer community, but more than just sort of a knowledge base. I think it goes back to, once again, like a way of looking at things and like perspective, and you know, Rex touching on just like constantly sort of like pushing back. And so yeah, I see it more as sort of like a orientation towards issues as opposed to just like a knowledge base.
Sure. And have you had experience in like alternative political spaces where you felt that you put your queerness aside in order to, I guess, assimilate? Or, you know, if somebody like misgenders you, you just like kind of throw it aside. You're like, this is not what's happening right now. This is a space for maybe anarchy. This is a space for anti-war protest. Like, what happens when you are placing one part of your identity aside for another part of your identity, and how can we bridge that gap in those spaces?
I think that's the goal of queerness. The goal of queerness, I think, is like never ignoring your identity and putting it in every single aspect of your life, like no matter where you are. Like smash the state and smash the gender binary and smash like marriage and heteronormativity. You know, like it's always about putting all of your identity first, and not really just being like in LGBT politics, not just being like, oh, like I'm gay, but like I'm gonna push that aside. Like here I am, just like a person. Like why do we need labels? Like here I am, gonna go to like the war machine now, like enlisting in the military. I mean, it's way more complex than that if I'm talking about military. But I mean, I feel like it's just like their goal is to like to gain as much privilege as possible. They are already white men, like people mainly in LGB, sorry. It's mainly white upper class men, cis men. So the goal of that agenda is to gain as much privilege as possible, so sexuality doesn't even matter.
Yeah, I really like that you mentioned that. I feel like we talked about this last night.
Yeah.
I feel like we should have just filmed our discussion last night. And that would be the queer panel. Wait, where was I going with this? Oh yeah, when we talked about how the LGBT agenda seems to be that they want everyone to just ignore sexual orientation, that it doesn't matter, and gender identity and things like that. I think it does matter. It is a very important part of who I am. It's a very important part of my lived experience. It's a very important part of my everyday life. And queerness, I think, celebrates, and I do say annoying things like celebrates, that experience, and how that does make queer people different from other people, and like that's a good thing. And I don't want to live in a world where everyone's like, oh yeah, Shannen's queer, that's just like me being straight, because it's not. And I don't think
It's boring. If you make it boring, it's gonna be boring.
Yeah.
Like I freak out when I hear another person's queer. I'm like, oh my god, we're friends.
Especially if they identify as queer. That's kind of like a secret handshake.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
So it's like, yeah, you're cool, like you're into cool things. But if you're just like gay, I'm like, okay, like.
And what kind of privilege are we coming at this conversation with when we talk about this? Like, if you go into a rural South setting, you don't have that opportunity most of the time, right?
I have never been to the rural South, so I don't.
Okay, well, we won't get into that conversation then. Okay,
You
sorry.
have though.
Have you?
Yeah, but not when you were identifying as queer though, right? Not to speak for you.
Well, I think it was sort of a thing where, well, like within my private life, I was identifying, I think maybe as bisexual at the time, not as queer now, but I guess this kind of goes to like queerness being a fundamental aspect of who someone is. There was definitely like a sense of otherness that was just like detected by my presence there that made people very uncomfortable.
Sure. And I mean, that's a big discussion to be had, like how to bring safety into spaces of radicalism, even when it's like something that's, when it's like hetero-dominant radical spaces, like there is still an issue of safety, and that's a big discussion unto itself. And I just wanted to kind of talk also to get out of that discussion for a little bit, because so much of queer panels is about that, to talk about the radicalness of like queer relationships and bringing those into spaces. And it seems that like there's a new normative of like polysexuality within the queer community, but that has not at all bridged into like heteronormativity at all. Do you guys want to talk about that? Can we talk about that?
I just don't know how much expertise I would have on it. I have noticed that in queer community recently, and maybe it's not so recent, maybe it's just something that's just now coming on my radar, but definitely an understanding and an appreciation for polyamorous relationships and non-monogamous relationships. But I don't really know if my opinions or experiences are like really like valid.
Well, I guess my question is if with people in those kind of when that relationship becomes a new norm, that's really introducing sexuality into other spaces, into like radical spaces where, you know, you could be in a room with like a few lovers and then there's like a web of love in this one room, you know what I mean, where you're trying to talk about like planning a protest against like an airbase that has drones, you know what I mean? Like that's completely separate of that undertone, but I guess how is it, have you guys seen that playing a part in the spaces you've been a part of?
I can't recall anything with
I
you.
can't. I mean, like, to be honest, I'm just a really jealous person. I can't be in anything politics.
Okay.
I have lots of friends who are polyamorous, we're also activists, we're also queer, and identify with multiple intersections of oppressions, and it's in changing the way we look at relationships, the way we engage with each other. That's challenging also the structure of how we interact, and it changes the way we interact in other relationships as well, because you kind of look at things differently, and you open up the conversations, and you make consensual relationships, and you have these conversations with lovers and with friends about your relationships and the stipulations between those, so conversation opens, and that allows spaces for other things within our activist circles to open up. So it's a beautiful thing.
Monogamy is capitalist, huh? Like, I didn't think about it until now. Like, you're kind of like, I'm out for someone, now I've trapped them, now they're mine forever.
It's a nuclear family, like, I got you, I'm gonna tell you, like, this is just this only relationship. So it's a way to open up our relationships. And
have you felt that it's strengthened whatever, like, societal goals that you guys have as a group, or you personally have?
Well, I've have really loving friendships with these folks, so I don't have any lovers in these groups.
Sure.
Very loving, and so even friendships take a a deeper, intimate approach to the way we interact with one another. And in that case, like, yeah, I mean, the conversations and the way that we interact with one another is different from, like, I had a group of LGBT friends, and there's boundaries, right? And even when someone else gets in another relationship, the boundaries that develop there, and it's very, like, you can feel it even. And in my other circles, my queer circles, it's just a different feeling. It's welcoming.
So do we have any practical words of wisdom towards bringing, I guess, acceptance of different gender and sexual identities into radical spaces?
If I backtrack for like a half second.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. I was just like taking in everything about the poly thing. I would say that, like, so my experience of the way I've experienced sort of poly played out in my queer community, I guess is the best way to put it. I would say that I think it's really awesome and really queer that we're having these conversations, that we're challenging, typical conceptions of relationships such as monogamy and things of that nature. I think that definitely is a part of the queer agenda that we kind of can talk about. But I am increasingly uncomfortable with what I feel is a tide of poly supremacy and queerer than thou politics that is starting to happen now, that sort of devalue monogamous queer relationships. So I just had to, like, get that out there. And
Also the like poly, and I'm using quotation marks because I don't believe that these people actually get to call themselves polyamorous, but they do. So I'm gonna, because I don't know what else to call them, but the polyamorous people who treat polyamory as like a capitalist enterprise, where they are taking everyone's resources from all of their partners and lovers, and then their partners and lovers are left completely, like, emotionally and, like, sexually drained, and they are happy and
people
fulfilled.
like commodities.
Yeah, and they are happy and fulfilled, and then the partners and lovers are, spent.
And amassing commodities.
And also collecting one person from every cultural background, every sexual or gender identity. Yeah, it's
well,
so.
I think that queerness is accepting difference, right? And so in queerness, accepting difference, there's room for, if that's their choice to live in that. I mean, we're here to accept difference, and if people want to live in that certain space, then. And say, like, pointing out, even in our own community, what we think people are doing wrong with their own life is not necessarily productive.
Right. I guess when does it become policing? When are we policing, like, people and their emotional intentions?
I think that, and I guess I'm speaking about really specific cases that I've seen. And I feel like I don't want to police anyone. I do know that there are a lot of different dynamics that play into emotional and sexual relationships, and I don't want to dismiss or diminish any of those emotional or sexual relationships. But I've seen a lot of really unhealthy, really and truly non-consensual manipulation and abuse happening, and it's done under a manipulative guise of what polyamory and non-monogamy is. And I've really seen it damage people in communities, and see really awesome people who brought a lot to spaces and campaigns just not feel comfortable or welcome anymore after things are all said and done. So, and it is something that kind of, did you have a?
So I guess there's responsible monogamy and there's responsible polyamory.
Yes, everyone has to be responsible in all of their relationships, regardless of what they're doing.
I think that it's important, like, definitely not to start policing those kinds of things, especially, like, talking about, like, some, like, specific types of situations, like the one that you're talking about. I find that a lot of especially a-spectrum polyamory can be really, like, healthy for people, especially, after trauma, especially, like, healing certain things and creating, like, relationships and dynamics that don't exist in a monogamous relationship. And I think it's really important to emphasize the worth of everyone's relationships.
I agree. I'm just not going to emphasize the word abusive relationships. I will never get behind that.
Well, and I would say, so sort of to the larger discussion here that we have, which is like, is queerness about all accepting? And sort of, and I don't think that's necessarily true. And I know that sounds like a very dangerous thing to say because it goes into this territory of policing, but I would say that there also is a certain level of sort of responsibility and critical thinking that goes into a queer identity, and making sure that we evaluate and deconstruct situations that can be oppressive. And so I wouldn't say that queerness is about total acceptance of all things.
And I guess one of my questions is, when is it a queer person's duty to educate, and when is ignorance intolerable? When is a line crossed?
It's like really never my job to educate people unless I choose so.
Okay.
Yeah, unless I like want to put myself in a vulnerable place where I trust that person. But I mean, honestly, if like the person seems like open to like learning, I guess like definitely I'm gonna put myself out there. But yeah, what was the other part of that question?
When is ignorance intolerable? When does it become a conversation that you don't want to have?
Honestly, it's just feeling energy and just like understanding this person's like intentions.
Absolutely.
And what they want to get out of me. Because like, if someone's gonna talk to me about my identity and like in a way that's either like really hypercritical, or like very like skeptical, like I'm not gonna share anything, and I'm just gonna be like, live your boring ass life, like. But yeah. Y'all?
Yeah, it's kind of a case-by-case thing for me. If someone seems like they're genuinely interested in learning and they're being respectful and not condescending, then I'm pretty much willing to talk to most people. But when I'm in a situation where I feel like I'm under attack, or like I'm going to be unsafe, or it's going to be too emotionally jarring or triggering for me, then I don't think it's ever my responsibility to educate anyone, but I like to, because people have educated me before, so I feel like I should pay it forward sometimes. But I'm also really hesitant to put an actual label on when ignorance is unacceptable, and like have like a formula for what we do when that happens, because I do think that a lot of these situations are really nuanced, and it really is case by case for me. Whenever anybody wants me to talk about what I think needs to be done with like problematic individuals in the movement, I'm like, oh, I don't know, I need to be in the situation. So.
Yeah, I agree. I think that a lot of times as queer people, we are, if not choosing to, we are forced to sort of live from like a self-preservation type of perspective, and you know, what is going to be safe for you, and that includes all forms of safety, not just physically, emotionally, and otherwise. So, you know, my approach to education, it is what is best for me in that moment, and that can sound very selfish when we love to talk about communities, but I think it's just sort of a necessity of a lot of people's, you know, queer people's lives. So if it's going to be, you know, empowering and awesome for me to educate at that moment, then I'm going to, you know, sometimes whether they want to hear it or not. And then if it's something where I just can't deal with it, and I'm gonna let, you know, a problematic comment about, you know, trans, you know, something roll off my back because I just don't have the emotional energy or the physical safety to do it, then I'm gonna do that, you know, and so I try to like afford other people in the queer community the same slack, you know. Sure.
I think that's the beauty of queerness. Like, I think I was like thinking about this question more, and I couldn't help but like feel like Shannen, like yes, like queer mom, like yes, like I don't know. I think that's the beauty of it. There's like, I feel like queerness has like a lineage, and it's very like intimate. This lineage, you know, it's just like I remember just Shannen telling me like little stories here and there about like her life and just like other stories that she had heard from like her like queer ancestors, and I think it's beautiful, this like chosen ancestral type deal, which is really queer. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, that's how I actually like, if I have found someone who's like genuinely interested in like queerness, like I like to drop like little nuggets of like truth or stories, just like, yeah, so like this happened, and then like way back in that day, like Sylvia Rivera was like, no.
Sylvia Rivera was like, no. Yeah, I think the whole concept of chosen families is really interesting and like a really beautiful concept because being queer, because you mentioned family, sorry, that's where I'm going with this, because a lot of queer people don't have support from the family they were born to for a lot of different reasons, and then sometimes it's just specifically because of their queerness. So I really like being a part of like Rex's chosen family and Sky's chosen family and having them as a part of my chosen family. So
can you just run with chosen family for a hot second? Also, I love having you in my chosen family.
Thank you.
I think
we're all friends.
And not to all queer people are friends. No, I'm just kidding. and not to backtrack at all to another topic, but I do. I think this does actually connect to the poly thing, and where this is something really beautiful that the queer community brings. It goes to, you know, with the poly thing or with chosen family or with all of these different ways that, you know, we might build relationships that other people, you know, or people outside the queer community don't necessarily value. It's about that, right? It's like valuing the individuals and the experiences and the relationships that, you know, the cis, heteronormative, patriarchal, etc. White supremacist world doesn't, you know, and so I think that's really important.
I want to like piggyback off you. I've actually recently found it. I've met a couple like queer Pacific Islanders, and I can't even like tell you if I thought like chosen queer family was like really awesome. Like I especially think like if you have like an ethnic similarity, queer chosen family is like even cooler. Like I can't even describe like the amount like I can talk to them like, oh, your parents do that, like my parents do that too, like, oh, like, do you want to go back to the homeland? Like, yeah, I don't feel safe, like, I would totally love to go like back like with you, like someone who has something like culturally the same as me. I think that's really important to have like, and something to be noted within queer spaces that we should definitely have our own spaces, like sometimes away from white queers, sometimes, you know, maybe if like non-black queer people are being like anti-black, like I think black queer people should have their own spaces. I think, you know, we should just, and that's part of like accepting everyone's differences. And it's also being critical because like I think the gay agenda is like, we're all one race, like we're all like one people, and like I feel like queerness is like, no, you're like this, you're like this.
When you talk about like imparting knowledge like from older queers to younger queers, it reminds me of this great book called Stone Butch Blues. I don't know if anyone here has read it. You all need to read it.
R.I.P.
I know, Leslie Feinberg, the wonderful author, died last year, and that was really hard on me. It was the first article I read when I woke up that morning. But anyways, in the book, the author, I feel like the main character in the book, Jess, is really kind of an autobiographical depiction of the author Leslie Feinberg. But it's about this young person who has a butch identity, and the first time she meets other like butches, they're older than she is at the time, and the line in the book is something along the lines of like, I looked at her and I wanted her to tell me what life was going to be like. And I remember, like, I am a femme, I'm sure you can tell, and I remember being younger and seeing like butch femme couples like walking around together and wanting to just go up to them and like sit them down and be like, tell me what life is going to be like what can I expect, because this has never been modeled for me before. I don't know what I'm supposed to do, and I didn't really have that, so I'm glad that I can kind of do. I didn't know that I did that for you guys.
Well, there's an identity that was palpable that you could latch onto, that it was like a nugget in your mind.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So read Stone Butch Blues and identify with it and cry your eyes out. I do, at least once a year.
Well, I guess if we're going to bring a little bit of literature into it, I've been thinking a lot about this really coveting recently of like the Riot Girl feminist movement that has been happening and like kind of like rising to the surface of like our social cultural like narrative. And I guess my question is about the fetishization of those movements, and do you think that it's helping or it's
Do I think that Riot Girl's helping?
yeah.
I feel like it gives like I feel like Riot Girl has given like Tumblr feminism like at least an aesthetic.
I guess I didn't mean to like go and bash it, but I guess
I will bash it.
No, but okay.
I mean, I love Riot Girl, but like
I'm thinking about like like Michelle T books. You have like these like most like women in San Francisco in the early '90s who are like basically like fuck men, you know what I mean? Like taking this kind of taking like
oh my god,
taking like an aggressive but not necessarily, but maybe like partially taking back violence, taking back aggression, and it's kind of a resurgence of that happening now, but with those ideals kind of stripped away.
Hell yeah.
You know what I mean? And but does it have a place?
Oh, sorry.
I just, so I organized with Long Beach Girl Collective, which formerly was Long Beach Riot Girl. And I actually didn't get involved when they first started organizing because I was like, ooh, Riot Girl is a really narrow view of feminism. And like, I just didn't really care because I had never listened to those bands. But we changed the name largely because we just had a lot of people who like wanted to come to shows and like look cool. And like, they don't care about feminism, they don't care about queerness. Like, they just really like music. Because I mean, it's a lot like the broader punk scene where there's a lot of people who just want to go to shows and like break bottles and they don't care about punk ethos or anything, you know, it's very similar. So there's a lot of like fashion to the movement and not a lot of substance in most cases, in my experience as someone who like was organizing for that banner for a while, and I'm glad we don't anymore, honestly.
Yeah.
There was a comment from the...
Oh yeah, I was just gonna say, at least from my experience in the punk community, I definitely felt that aesthetic where it's just Riot Girl doesn't have a lot of substance to it sometimes, especially like now, and he just kind of like tokenizes feminism in the punk movement. Like it's like, oh, those are like the feminist punks, and they don't really want to use it to critique the whole structure of like punk subculture itself and how it might be sexist. And like, I don't know. I get that Riot Girl was really important to like the history of punk, but I feel like it more gets used to tokenize people into this really narrow category.
Yeah, this is coming from someone who, as a high school student, idolized Kathleen Hanna, and I say that probably a little less embarrassed about it than I should be, but I do understand all of the many things that were bad about the Riot Girl movement, and I also understand the things that were positive that came out of Riot Girl. And I guess at this point, and this isn't, and I don't intend to denigrate the actions or organizing efforts of any group at all who has organized or is organizing with that name. But I kind of just, and I'm a big believer in reclaiming words and phrases in certain spaces to be empowering. But I kind of just feel like it might be too soon for Riot Girl. And I kind of just feel like people can make something way better than Riot Girl was and call it something else with like a cooler name, you know? Even though Riot Girl is a cool name.
Are you afraid of queerness or like radical queerness being like capitalized on?
Yes. Yeah. All the time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I also don't feel like there's enough like scrutiny on like Riot Girl. I feel like it's
or like what about like RuPaul? Like everybody loves Drag Race. Like you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like,
well, that's really gay capitalist. I mean, they plug everything every 5 seconds. They're like absolute vodka. Like here's my new album.
And can I just say, like they've had people on that show who have had like after the show you find out that they had really bad substance abuse problems, and they're plugging these absolute vodka ads in every single episode. And like we're a community that, and I drink. Like this is not a straight edge perspective. We're coming from a community of people who are susceptible to substance abuse issues, who are susceptible to suicide and depression and all kinds of like really awful illnesses. And I think that it's completely irresponsible to glamorize the consumption of alcohol on a mainstream show.
They stopped like I think like season 5. But I know that they also, which bugs me, I feel like they don't highlight the people who identify as queer or like who don't identify as cisgender on the show. Because there are some drag queens who've like come out on that show, or there are some like come out later and like, hey, like I'm non-binary, like, you know.
It's almost like they're embarrassed of it, really, because they have like you know alums who have transitioned as well, and like I know that there's tension. Yeah, there's tension there between those people.
Definitely. But yeah, Riot Girl. I feel like I feel like there's not enough criticism. I think it's just like people like listen to Kathleen and they're like, oh, like cool, but they don't really like delve into like how racist like Riot Girl was, like
and
like,
how racist Kathleen Hanna is to this day.
And like trans misogynist. Yeah, so yeah, Riot Girl R.I.P. But like yeah.
I like how you referred to her by her first name, by the way, Kathleen.
I would say hi to her at the grocery store and be like, hey, Kathleen.
Oh, and so Kathleen Hanna, I think most people know who she is, but she was the lead singer of Bikini Kill.
Yeah. And she often gets credited for
like starting a Riot Girl movement, which was late 80s, early 90s, women's punk, basically cis men at the back, but women to the front, but it did erase trans identities. But
yeah,
and that's another thing, like how much do we believe in things coming in steps, you know what I mean, like, and wanting those steps to happen, you know what I mean? Like now we have the visibility of people like Laverne Cox, like Janet Mock, like all these like mostly trans women of color who are like joining the limelight and like kind of leading the crusade for trans visibility. I don't know. I'm kind of like all for it for the sake of safety, you know, because anti-violence is becoming like a buzzword within the queer community, but I'm wondering if that's even just staying in the queer community. You know what I mean?
I think these baby steps are still radical. Like how radical, like, it's crazy to think, I mean, not crazy, it's weird to think that, like, Laverne Cox playing a trans woman of color is, like, radical, but, like, that's what we're doing, that's, like, the society we live in, too. And
also, cool. About Laverne Cox, something that's interesting, she was on the latest episode of the Mindy Project, I don't know if any of you watch it, but her character, I don't think was supposed to be a trans woman, and I think that that's really awesome that Laverne Cox just got to play
a woman,
an everyday black woman, and not that being trans makes me, but you know, it's sorry. I feel like maybe I stepped into territory that maybe I'm not qualified to speak on, so I apologize. But
like, do you like you're talking about like maybe this is too quick towards erasure, towards like.
Well, I know that she, or maybe it was Alexandra Billings, who teaches at this school, by the way. I can't remember, but it was one of those women who said that they think that it will be a sign of real change when trans people get to start playing cis people, or when trans characters get to be trans characters without all of this like. Sensationalism where they're dying in a hospital bed or they're homeless or you know something where trans people are just living lives the way cis people are or portrayed the way cis people are.
I feel like we could keep going.
Yeah.
Like I was just thinking about, you know, now portrayal of like trans women in the media but played by cis men. Like that's a huge trend that's happening now too, and then
Jared Leto.
Yeah. Or Eddie Redmayne and all that. But I guess I want to open it to questions before we.
Yeah, we only have like 5 minutes left.
Yeah. Or anything to say about the conversation or how you feel about. Okay. Yeah, Alex?
Oh, it's becoming a new trend of heterosexual couples identifying as queer, including their relationship in a queer fashion. Are there any thoughts on that?
What do you mean?
That's a thing?
Yeah.
I don't like it when like straight people say partner. I don't like that.
So I'm all about queering straightness to a certain extent. But I'm also not interested in straight people appropriating our words, our culture, our history.
I do accept though, like, if anybody watches Broad City, I don't know, like Alana's depiction of being like a straight, open woman, like, I don't know, okay, so there's a character in this show who principally dates men, but then is like seemingly open to any sort of, any gendered, like, romantic relationship, and that, I'm kind of comfortable with that.
Like at Brooklyn Nine-Nine, Andy Samberg is like not like an ambiguous TV character. Like sometimes he'll like ask out a guy or ask out a girl, and like both like whatever, like these like set like relationship kind of things.
Right.
And it's interesting. It's an interesting thing to see happen on television.
Well, I guess the problem comes when that straight couple is doing it to be tokenized.
Yeah.
You know.
Maybe it's an issue also of sort of just like recognition of where those, like, I think it's great, you know, I agree with Shannen, like when we're talking about queering like straightness, that's awesome, that's great, but maybe what those couples need to be doing instead of co-opting like queer as their community, go like, hey, like we've been like super influenced by like these ideals that we've seen played out in queer community, or like we've been super influenced by like these queer, you know, maybe that's the better way.
Like taking a back seat rather than.
Yeah, to like, obviously like you can express it and you can like engage with it, but that doesn't mean that you like own it, you know?
Finding their own ways to make straight relationships less oppressive.
Yeah, and kind of, I guess in some ways, and giving that credit, then, you know, and being like, hey, this is something that like we've tried to take away from like the queer community, but not be like we're a part of the queer community.
Right.
I was wondering how you, and I'm not trying to like sound facetious or anything, but how you identify a straight couple, because like you can still say someone's in a heterosexual, well not, you can't say someone's in a heterosexual relationship if they're bisexual, but it still looks like on the surface as like straight, and they could say that they're queer easily, but I'm wondering, you know, like if they're in a monogamous relationship and they seem heterosexual, how do you like identify someone as straight?
I actually have knowledge of this because my friend, her partner, they're both queer, but they're in a heterosexual relationship, but they're both overtly queer. Were they not in a relationship, they would date whoever they want, type of deal. And I just know that it bothers them when they're assumed to be straight because they're not straight, right? They're not heterosexual people. That's all I have.
Sure, but I think there always needs to be a lenience, like, to that, you know, attack that happens, you know, when people would refer to that. I think this is a problem that I encounter when people are saying like, don't erase my identity. It's like, well, oh, I'm sorry, I'm not trying to, like, it's just really hard to exist in this world without like categories, without me like identifying you as something, and like, I guess there needs to be that level of humbleness, and also that level of, you know,
definitely
like conversation to be able to have.
I think there's also like a level of like, I want to say like realization that you now have passing privilege.
Yeah.
Because like not all of us can like walk down the street and like, you know, not look like you're like with a beard, you know. like so.
Yeah, absolutely, I agree.
And let me tell you, when you've been in a straight relationship for long enough and you go on your first like date with someone who's like, who you're not passing as a straight couple with, all of that like fear and all of that concern and all of that like anxiety rushes back to you in this really unsettling way, and it's such a rude awakening.
Yeah. It's a different experience. You're the same person. You're still queer. You were queer at all points in the in all relationships, but it's a different experience.
Yeah. Well, that's all the time we have. But I'm sorry if we didn't get to. Did you have something small to say?
No, I was going to ask if that entire anxiety is why sometimes within the lesbian and gay community there's this anxiety around bisexual people. Yeah. Like I thought my Shannen's point was very poignant, and I thought that point.
Yeah. I mean, that's a conversation thankfully everybody's having now. Being like, wait, don't forget the B.
Putting the B back in LGBT.
Yeah. Well, thank you, everybody. I hope this was helpful. I hope this was fine.
Yeah, thank you guys all
Thank you.
for coming to the conference. I really appreciate it. See you next year, hopefully.
Yay.